ごきげんよう。特別なクエストが来ていますよ。いってらっしゃいませ。
浜風一陣迫り来る。
出発。頼むぜ。そら行け。いただくぜ。取った。
狩りの基本だ。
出てくるぞ。熱くの進撃だぜ。 がたくいただくぜ。帰還するぜ。
備えあれば憂いなしでございます。お気をつけて。本日大特価でございます。さて、おお、これはなかなか
いいお天気ですね。ご自愛くださいね。
やあ君か。応援してるよ。
ミスターラウンドは至福の味わい。ホムラの加護がありますよ
昇級し
うに。大歓迎。今日は何する？お任せあれ。
行くぜ。
お先も
出発。はいよ。そら行け。せいやっさ。はいよ。
You shouldn't be here when it gets dark.
頼むぜ。
That's impressive, don't you think? Vampire bats weigh almost nothing, but they can down a creature nearly 10 times their size.
Before the sun goes down.
追いかけよう。
移動したか。そら行け。
危険だぞ。気をつけて。シュー。
もらうぜ。
17 years ago, there was an MMORPG that pioneered the three-faction realm versus realm PvP in-game that many current MMOs such as ESO and Guild Wars 2 take inspiration from. This MMORPG went back to Arthurian legends of old, Dark Age of Camelot. It was the age of chivalry and the War of the Three Kingdoms. To the mountains, to the kingdom of Arthur's, Albion, to the forests located in the heart of the realm that made up the forces of the mythical kingdom of Hibernia, to the frigid, cold, snowed lands of the rebellious kingdom of Midgard. These three kingdoms caught in what seemed like a perpetual state of war. And this is what makes up the plot and background for Mythic Entertainment's first true MMORPG title, Dark Age of Camelot. Dark Age of Camelot at one point saw as many as 250,000 concurrent players, a true feat for a PvP-centric MMORPG, and managed to do so as a small company with a small budget, who went toe-to-toe with other MMORPG titans such as EverQuest, Ultima Online, and even later on, World of Warcraft. Dark Age of Camelot as of 2018 certainly isn't literally dead, and still has quite the dedicated core fanbase who play both the live server and the fan-created server Uthgard, but only a fraction of the same population it once had in its most successful years. On this episode of Death of the Game, we will uncover the mystery behind the MMORPG that helped define the PvP genre, and answer the question behind it. Why didn't Dark Age of Camelot's reign last long? Why did Dark Age of Camelot fade into obscurity? Take up arms and claim your faction, Midgard, Albion, or Hibernia, and prepare the drums of war. Oh, and make sure to pay attention to the clues. We can solve this one together, but if you miss out, I will take the time to catch you guys up near the end of the episode. And finally, at the end of this episode, there will be a clue for what the next episode is going to be on. So get working, detectives. Typically, I take the time to explain the whole origin of a company, but because Mythic can get its own company video done in the future, I'll focus for this video primarily on Dark Age of Camelot and Mythic's involvement with such. The story of Dark Age of Camelot starts in 1999. The company behind the title, Mythic Entertainment, had been founded officially in 1995, but the company itself had existed in two different companies, one led by Mark Jacobs and one Rob Denton. Between the two companies, they had an awful lot of experience in online games. Mark Jacobs had his company, Adventures Unlimited Software, and Rob Denton his, Interesting Systems Incorporated. When the two joined together in 1995, the main team existed of Mark Jacobs, the president, Rob Denton, the COO and co-founder, and the producer, Matt Farrar. Mythic Entertainment pre-2000s launched a number of online games. Most influential and relevant for the story of Dark Age of Camelot, though, was their two projects, Darkness Falls: The Crusade and The Spellbinder: The Nexus Conflict. Darkness Falls was Mythic Entertainment's online MUD, meant to compete with EverQuest and Ultima Online. However, Darkness being a text-based title meant that it couldn't compete with either title enough for Mythic's liking. What was unique about Darkness Falls was in one simple facet of design, a feature that frankly changed how we look at MMORPGs for time to come: three-faction PvP. Yes, what Mythic discovered with their quiet title of Darkness Falls, their text-based title, was that they could create a game that had near endless amounts of content due to the fact that in their text-based MUD, you could PvP with three different factions. The basic design of the game was a three-faction PvP-only game. You got realm points when you killed a player, and you were supposed to try and cap all of the realm orbs, or idols. This was incredibly relevant for the creation of Dark Age of Camelot's base design. The idea was simple. If you could get players engaged and teach them to associate with one particular faction, faction pride, you could have players long after the game's launch and content drought still enjoying the game. Tribalism, as problematic as it can be in society, is actually quite effective in video games. And as most DAOC fans watching this can agree, boy was Mythic absolutely right about that. But where Spellbinder: The Nexus Conflict title comes into play is establishing relationships with a gameplay engine. Spellbinder was an arena shooter game of sorts that was a fully represented graphical online RPG. As producer Matt Farrar later shared in a post-mortem on DAOC, after working with Minimerse on Spellbinder: The Nexus Conflict, Dark Age of Camelot would be using the same game engine. Oh, Metamerse is also known by the title Gamebryo. Yes, that same original Bethesda engine. The Gamebryo engine was pioneered first for MMOs, but Dark Age of Camelot would be using the Metamerse engine, which is technically the same engine, just an older one. Dark Age of Camelot would be the first title to use this engine. The most important feature for Dark Age of Camelot was indeed its engine, ultimately, as it meant that with their newest title, it could be completely realized in graphical 3D, as well as it meant that they could compete with Ultima, and most importantly for the time, EverQuest 1. After completing the Spellbinder project, we decided to create a graphical online role-playing game to compete with the new wave of online RPGs, such as Ultima Online and EverQuest. We were taking traditional text-based games and adding a graphical front-end, with very successful results. Over the years, we had developed several non-graphical online role-playing games, including Dragon's Gate and Darkness Falls: The Crusade. Because of our experience developing RPGs, we knew that it had to be a slightly different slant in our new title in order to distinguish it from the RPGs that were already on the market. So Mythic, with engine in hand, and the idea of what content their MMORPG would focus on in Darkness Falls 3-Faction Realm PvP, set out to work on their newest MMORPG. This title was to be dubbed Darkness Falls Conflict 3D, meant to be a sequel to Darkness Falls: The Crusade title. But Mythic, despite having previous online titles, was not a company of immense wealth or success yet. They were operating on a budget and certainly didn't have the capital to purchase an IP, and their MMO was in desperate need of a setting. Matt Farrar later said that we were proceeding along the concept of DFC 3D until our president, Mark Jacobs, came up with the idea of basing the game at least partially on the Arthurian legends. It was a great idea since the stories of King Arthur are now in the public domain, which meant that we could use them with no fear of licensing issues. Of course, because the game was based on the idea that 3 realms were in conflict, we quickly came up with the idea of basing the other 2 realms on Norse Viking myths and Celtic Irish legends, respectively. Having the myths and legends of these 3 cultures give Camelot the feel of being 3 games in one, since each realm has different races, classes, guilds, terrain, and monsters. But Mythic hadn't had the kind of success that would allow them to solely focus on developing one game, and they would certainly need such for an MMO the size and scale of Dark Age of Camelot. They found an investor in the company Abandon Entertainment, who took a minority interest in Mythic, which allowed Mythic enough funding to fund their game from start to completion. So Darkness Falls Conflict 3D became Dark Age of Camelot, and around January 2000, Mythic began full production on Dark Age of Camelot. And unheard of for an MMO, they set their sights on a late 2001 launch, which would mean that they were going to develop the game in less than 2 years. So Mythic would not only develop the game in 18 months, they would do so with a budget of $2.5 million and a team of 25 full-time developers. Now that's quite a feat. Matt also said in the post-mortem piece, our spreadsheets showed that we had enough money to support exactly 18 months of development, starting from January 2000, giving the project a hard end date of September 2001. When funds say you only have 18 months to get your product out, 18 months is all you're gonna get. The way that Dark Age of Camelot was able to be developed in such a short time, besides, well, blood, sweat, and tears, is the fact that they developed the MMO with another engine superior to the one that Mythic had previously used. This meant that they didn't have to spend years developing their own engine system. In conjunction with this, they were able to use their original DFC titles' server code as platform for their newer game's backend. Another aspect that certainly affected this was the use of Darkness Falls database. This meant that creatures, objects, and weapons in that database would give the Mythic team an extra head start in their development, especially with all the engine server backend I previously mentioned. Mythic Entertainment was existing at a time where it was nearly impossible to launch a game without a publisher to handle distribution, especially because everything was hard copy. And everyone except one investor turned down Mythic Entertainment when they pitched Dark Age of Camelot, except Vivendi Universal Games. Many people here are thinking Illuminati thoughts right now. That's because Vivendi, of course, for the longest time has had a major stake in Blizzard. It makes you realize how connected this whole market is. Dark Age of Camelot launched on October 9th, 2001. For a game that was only projected by the team to sell 30,000 copies, which back in 2001 was really a major success, Mythic managed to sell 51,000 copies in the first 4 days. We sold about 50,000 units within the first 5 days. We had not expected such a positive response, so our publisher, Guerrilla Games, had made a limited run of launch product. This, I believe, contributed to our very smooth launch. We did not get slammed all at once as modern MMOs do, and rather we enjoyed a very steady and gradual increase in players, which allowed us the time to respond from the development perspective. Dark Age of Camelot was getting glowing reviews. It had an 88 on Metacritic. Players and critics alike were raving about how much fun the game could be. Realm 5 strong, there were strong battles and wars between the 3 factions, and ranked matches. Realm Pride was awarded on the server due to them obtaining realm points for participating in the battles as a realm, and the servers overall held up due to them already having experience in running an online game. Having to purchase their own server equipment, they learned an awful lot about server infrastructure, which meant that even though the large battles of hundreds and maybe even thousands could occur in the game, the servers were managing to keep up as best as they could for the time. PvP was the game. Dark Age of Camelot had been designed from the ground up to perform as a PvP title. With Midgard, Hibernia, and Albion all at war with each other, the PvP was clear in a way the crowning feature of the game. The reason that three-faction realm versus realm works effectively is it allows there to be enough conflict shared between two opponents for each faction. For completely unique races with completely unique classes, each faction had a number of apparent differences. This made each battle different, as you had the potential to face as many as 32 classes within 12 races. Think about the amount of options and experiences you have that would be unique. But also, as the developers early on remarked, 3 factions meant 3 different zones of content, essentially the equivalent of 3 starter zones and 3 leveling zones, as well as PvP zones. And if one faction grew to be too powerful, the other factions were incentivized to gang up and defeat the other faction due to them wanting the buffs that relics granted, which were objects of power in the realm. So players were immersed into their realms and factions, and there was PvP for all types of players. You had small-scale battles, 8-man pre-mage, which were 8-man pre-mage groups that would often travel and engage other Midgard teams in RBR lanes. Then finally you had the massive Zerg versus Zerg fight, that I think we all can enjoy every now and then, even the fights that were over the keeps, objectives, and realms. What made Dark Age of Camelot specifically unique was that 8-man pre-mage groups could very well give Zergs trouble. In fact, it's even possible that an 8-man pre-mage could potentially even wipe part of the Zerg. 8-man pre-mages were all about strategies. They were about using the proper roles and teamwork in order to take out larger groups. This meant that you had to utilize things like CC, outplay your opponents, outbeat your opponents, outposition your opponents, and even small things such as mine to thrive in a game that otherwise was very unfriendly to small groups of players. That's what made Dark Age of Camelot sort of unique. It had gameplay for the large-scale player and the small-scale player, and all the in-between. Dark Age of Camelot, unlike most PvP MMOs that followed, was masterful in that they separated the PvE player base and PvP player base. Many casual MMO fans have horror stories of being killed by a PvP player, to the point that even if you like PvP in a game, you are usually automatically labeled Reaper. This is usually because in an open world PvP game, a PvE player can be a casualty of conflict. But although this is true in some ways, say for example the in-game in PvPvE Darkness Falls dungeon that came shortly after, which could be conquered by a realm and then would provide some domestic rewards. It was a beautiful merging of the two audiences. Besides that feature, Dark Age of Camelot kept the audiences separate due to the way that frontiers worked. Each realm, so to say, had its home frontier. That was PvP free, aka a safe zone, so to say, for players to PvE in peace. But as soon as you stepped into that mortal frontier, you got extra XP due to PvP in such a dangerous zone, and you also got the ability to PvP against the other factions. It was almost like PvE players still had some level of agency, which is likely why Dark Age of Camelot was able to maintain somewhat of a PvE population, despite not being a PvE-focused game. And the game did have its weaknesses, and PvE certainly was one of those weaknesses. But that was simply due to them not having enough creatures, quests, or dungeons yet in the game, and those were promised with upcoming expansions, which were said to be free content updates to the game. Oh, the good old days. By the end of 2001, Dark Age of Camelot had a population of 110 players. For comparison, its competition in EverQuest and Ultima had populations of 400,000 and 225,000 respectively. Mythic had struck essentially gold with their Realm vs. Realm PvP. The reason that Realm vs. Realm is especially great as a system and in-game is because the whole game is built around it. It has room to thrive and succeed. It doesn't require a whole lot of developer interference. It's emergent gameplay. That means that it's always new and it's always fresh. And there are enough tools and sand in the box for the game to essentially play out on its own. This meant that Mythic as a developer wouldn't be as reliant on pushing out more and more content. This explains why when you look at DAOC's population numbers up to a certain point, they nearly never drop in population for any significant amount. That's because when most MMORPGs launch, they run out of content due to a reliance on developer-made content. People blaze through the in-game content that is finite, but Mythic understood that early on with their small success with Darkness Falls, that long after your game launches, if you can make a compelling and immersive experience, you can have players playing on for years on end, because the ever state of conflict in PvP content is not finite. By the summer of 2002, Dark Age of Camelot reached as many as 250,000 players, which in hindsight was actually its peak of popularity. By this point of the game, next to no large changes had happened yet. But that's because instead of a bunch of small and spread out patches, Mythic seemed to want to focus on big content expansions. And since Mythic put out consistent content expansions over the next following years, we can use the release dates of each of these content expansions to track the population, and therefore the popularity of Dark Age of Camelot, through each of these patches. It's this way we can hope to most effectively piece together the clues as to why Dark Age of Camelot was unable to maintain their peak population past a certain point. The first of the content expansions launched in November 12, 2002 was dubbed Shrouded Isles. It added 6 new classes, 3 new races, and a brand new land for each realm, in addition to the previous ones. Based on this helpful chart that somebody took the time to fill out in the community, Dark Age of Camelot during this expansion, end of 2002, seemed to have a minor drop in population following the Shrouded Isles expansion. I speculate this is because of the lack of content starting to catch up to them, as well as competitors doing better in the marketplace. It's not a significant drop, however. Within the next year, Dark Age of Camelot had 2 more expansions. One first that added player housing and player consignment shops, both 2 very appreciated features by players such as myself. The population at this point in Dark Age of Camelot jumps back up to 225,000 players. But the third expansion, Trials of Atlantis, came in October 28, 2003. This expansion added 3 new races, upgraded terrain graphics, addition of boats and underwater combat, and a new form of progression which devs promised wouldn't have a significant effect on RVR. What's interesting about Trials of Atlantis, though, is talking to the fans, I came away thinking that Trials of Atlantis was this big negative patch or expansion. But through analyzing the numbers and, well, the facts behind it, if anything, the population returned to its peak during Trials of Atlantis, so it actually increased in population. Though there was criticism warranted for the expansion, the master levels that were added to the game as a form of new progression did affect realm versus realm PvP, and thus were a new progression that had to be grinded. It's certainly interesting. When I go back through and take a look at a timeline of events, and you start to notice that in most MMOs, people base their argument of whether or not a patch or an expansion was good as to whether it was good to them personally, and not historically. And when population isn't significantly dropping following an expansion, it's safe to say that it wasn't the expansion that caused the drop that happened, well, much later. New Frontiers, the expansion that launched on June 22nd, 2004. This was probably the most disliked expansion due to it remaking many of the game's core RPM systems. Mythic wanted to add more complexity to the meta they perceived as being stale. They added new siege mechanics and more variety in the way they were able to play. Now there are mixed reviews regarding New Frontiers. Some argue its changes were for the worse overall, and it's often lumped in with Trials of Atlantis for being a problematic expansion. But others believe that change was necessary and appreciated the addition of mechanics and complexity to the RVR system in Dark Age of Camelot. But what I noticed when trying to decipher who was right and what the verdict on New Frontiers or Trials of Atlantis was, I made a startling discovery that throughout Dark Age of Camelot's first 4 years of expansions, it never really gained population after either expansion. It only ever essentially recovered what numbers were lost. It never peaked past 250,000 players, and when the end of 2004 rolled around, well, the largest 2 reasons for Dark Age of Camelot's inability to maintain its level of success or increase it are quite apparent. With the gift of hindsight from looking at the numbers of Dark Age of Camelot's population, truthfully speaking, the expansions didn't really swing the population in any one way or the other in one noticeable pattern. Although it's fun to talk game theory and speculate what changes have erased effects, and which didn't. Unless we can go back and be there to study them as they occurred, we can only turn to facts. Population data shrug as we notice that, well, none of the expansions ever seem to live as long as set of Exodus, like the NGE did to Star Wars Galaxies. So Dark Age of Camelot, as a game, didn't really fail necessarily. Well, that's up until the end of 2004. Early November 2004, EQ2 launches. Weeks later, World of Warcraft launches. 2 titans of the time were going head-to-head, both boasting new gameplay engines, graphics, and 3D experiences. All of a sudden, Dark Age of Camelot seemed dated by players. Its now older engine was starting to struggle. Even in Morrowind, which launched in 2004, struggled with the same engine-dated gameplay. But more so than just that, World of Warcraft in less than 2 years had 5 million players. The gameplay in WoW was buttery smooth, and the game itself was obviously quite revolutionary in many ways, including ease of access. Dark Age of Camelot immediately took a massive population hit following the launch of WoW. By 2005, Dark Age of Camelot had dropped 50,000 players, now at this point had 200,000 players overall. And even after a number of quality expansions, Dark Age of Camelot, just 1 year later, had 125,000 players. This number matches with World of Warcraft, and other MMORPGs as they lost population during the same time. World of Warcraft had gotten nearly to 6 million players by 2006. So although I hate the edgy YouTube commenters who say WoW is the reason about every MMO failing, in this case, WoW was an obvious significant factor in the drop of population in Dark Age of Camelot, way more than any of the previous expansions, not even the controversial Trials of Atlantis or New Frontiers. But it's hard to quantify what sort of effect WoW had on Dark Age of Camelot, other than us simply knowing that it did. My speculation on it is that WoW Classic had a more smooth combat gameplay experience than Dark Age of Camelot could offer. With all of its other streamlined features, it might have been a case of Dark Age of Camelot simply looking and feeling dated. But WoW isn't the only reason that Dark Age of Camelot started to fail. The second largest reason isn't interesting. In 2005, Mark Jacobs seemed to realize he needed to elevate his performance past Dark Age of Camelot and attempted to make a new generation MMORPG title. So it shook the web in May of 2005 when Mythic obtained the Warhammer license to make a Warhammer MMO. Now, I can't blame Mark Jacobs here, as I was set on a bigger picture. Dark Age of Camelot, despite having a great game and particularly having a playing state that was not losing population at a high rate, it was still, well, getting old. The game looked and played dated, especially as the market evolved. Warhammer Online had its own interesting story that I covered in a video on my channel, but let's focus on why this affects Dark Age of Camelot. Warhammer Online was competition to Dark Age of Camelot, no matter how you slice it. Mark Jacobs was designing an MMO to be very similar to the MMO that he, well, still currently developing. Now, to understand why he didn't or couldn't deliver on those promises, my video on the game should explain that. But I would wait until I get an update version of that video. It's a Patreon donation goal. Advertising. But Mythic Entertainment as a company only has a finite amount of resources. This obviously started to focus more heavily on Warhammer Online development rather than Dark Age of Camelot. In the span of 3 years, Dark Age of Camelot only launched 2 expansions, and they were more likely to content patches than the full expansion that was released previously. There were more reasons that Mythic started to lose focus on Dark Age of Camelot, and them being acquired by EA in June of 2006 certainly didn't help. Mythic producer Matt Furore immediately left and was hired by ZeniMax to head ZeniMax Online Studios and work on ESO. And Mark Jacobs began to lose control of his company, especially considering rumors of Rob Denton and him not seeing eye to eye and possible betrayal. Mark Jacobs now had his own bosses. Perhaps we can speculate they didn't want to focus on Dark Age of Camelot as his population was dropping and they were more riding on the success of Warhammer Online. 2 years passed, and the New Frontiers patch, as it was jokingly called, launched on September 5th, 2007. The population of Dark Age of Camelot had dropped below 100,000 players. Expansions nor changes weren't recovering the population anymore. And as Warhammer Online creeped closer and closer to launch, it had a playable beta that likely already affected Dark Age of Camelot's population numbers as well. Warhammer Online launches in September of 2008, and Dark Age of Camelot drops to 50,000 players. The population only continues to dwindle the next few years, as changes are smaller and smaller, possibly due to the limitations of the game engine. But the fans who keep playing the game, the die-hard fans, they kept the game alive. Elder Scrolls Online launches in 2013, led by former dev Matt Furore, mirroring many of the systems that Dark Age of Camelot used. The pioneer in that field was certainly looking the part. But Dark Age of Camelot got a random bit of resurgence in 2014 when DAOC was moved to Broadsword Online Games, a company specifically created to run Dark Age of Camelot and Ultima Online functions. Rob Denton would head that company shortly after Mythic would be shuttered by EA. But this was kind of good for Dark Age of Camelot, because although their parent company ceased to exist and they were handed off to another company, this meant that they would get freed of the grasp from a company who stopped focusing on them and, well, frankly, Broadsword Online Games was going to give them more personal development. In December of 2017, Dark Age of Camelot released a producer's letter discussing their upcoming free-to-play announcement targeted in 2018. They were dubbing it Endless Conquest. This free-to-play relaunch of sorts would make the game focus on RVR features, growing the population by more marketing and more community engagement, and hope to inject more population into the game through the free-to-play business switch. This would allow players to enjoy Dark Age of Camelot through level 50 and beyond for free without a paid sub, but naturally would limit XP, classes, character slots, ease of use, and other similar and typical FTP features. They even further teased that seeming to base such a decision on the reception of their newest launch, that they would consider a new rule set server as well. The rule set hadn't been determined yet, and was a reason why they weren't sure when that part of the plan would actually be ready, but it was looking quite optimistic for a title that seemed to stop getting any significant love. Dark Age of Camelot was still kicking. if only barely, but a free-to-play possible relaunch could revitalize the game, so to speak. But in a bit of unfortunate news, in the summer of 2018, Dark Age of Camelot would be delaying their Endless Conquest update. The website still hasn't updated and says that they're still targeting the end of the year for the patch, but reported massively that they will be delaying it to first quarter 2019. So Dark Age of Camelot still very much exists today, though certainly in a state of, well, uncertainty. Will the free-to-play relaunch of sorts come, and will it be successful? Or will the game continue to function on its core gameplay as players slowly burn out? As of 2018, Dark Age of Camelot still has about 6,000 players playing the game at peak, divided amongst the different realms of course. But this is a previous drop from their 2016 numbers, which had them drop from 9,000 players to 6,000 players. And when the new content isn't being implemented anymore, that population will continue to shrink as people who play the game at this point are still paying subscriptions. It also affects the new influx of players, as free-to-play switches nearly always increase both revenue and the player count. I certainly think it's quite impressive a game that's now 17 years old can function with a player base larger than many current MMORPGs, and it's quite apparent that Mythic, despite their failures and ultimate demise, struck gold with the design behind Dark Age of Camelot. My proof for this is simple. Look at the amount of money that Blizzard has put into WoW for it to continue to, well, make money. It was nearly completely reliant on developer-made content, whereas Dark Age of Camelot, who existed before that game, managed to continue to support its population without much increase of population. This meant that frankly Dark Age of Camelot's game model is a bit more sustainable in the long term, relying on players to make the content and giving them tons of ways to do such, and content that incentivizes them to do such was a brilliant move. Realm pride being such a focus in Dark Age of Camelot meant that rivalries were kept alive, and it made it so easy when each side was so passionate about their own factions and their war efforts. Dark Age of Camelot might not be to the same scale of its heyday these days, but its impressions are certainly felt on the market, with popular MMORPGs such as Guild Wars 2 and Elder Scrolls Online both utilizing forms of DAOC's in-game systems. But the reason I think that those games can't quite capture the same magic that Dark Age of Camelot was able to capture was that Dark Age of Camelot was a game carefully crafted to focus first and foremost on its realm versus realm PvP content. That in itself made it so that the game had so much more content within that one facet, and nearly every aspect of the game otherwise served a purpose towards that goal. I think in the case of Dark Age of Camelot, it falls under the banner of what I dub the PvE bias, which means as a PvE player who is PK'd in some other game, you hold this irrational grudge towards all PvPers or PvP games. I often see it parroted on forums that PvP MMORPGs are somehow destined to fail, that EVE was the only successful PvP MMO, and that Dark Age of Camelot couldn't maintain its success, therefore it doesn't count as evidence. I hope that by this point of the video you can already call bullshit on that, because although we can certainly point out the game's flaws, the fact that it was focused on PvP certainly wasn't a documented reason why it failed. Not to mention, Dark Age of Camelot was crafted with a 25-person team in less than 2 years for $2.4 million. Most AAA MMOs have 10 times that budget. You can't knock the success of Dark Age of Camelot. It was essentially a indie niche MMORPG that performed relatively well in comparison to its titan competition. By all initial metrics, the game was a success, and we can certainly say long-term it certainly has been a success based on its influence. It just was aged out of the market and had to compete with budgets frankly out of their league. Now let's open up our journals. It's that part that I was talking about in the very beginning of the video. Let's write down the key biggest reasons that Dark Age of Camelot failed, to make sure you guys were keeping up with the clues along the way. The engine not properly being able to propel the game to the next generation of MMO gameplay or compete with its competition. Warhammer Online took more resources and took precedent over it after 2005. WoW was stiff competition. Newer, more accessible titles such as ESO and Guild Wars 2 looked to drive inspiration from Dark Age of Camelot, and were able to do so with some level of success. But although we're at the end of this mystery, so to say, this is where things get really exciting. Whether you are a loyalist DAOC fan watching this video who is still very interested in playing the classic game, or whether you have never played the game before and you don't think that you're going to go back and play the game, there's some good news. Mark Jacobs announced back in 2013 he would be working on a new MMO, Sans Publisher, titled Camelot Unchained. This title would be meant to be a true spiritual successor to Dark Age of Camelot, and would be a crowdfunded project on Kickstarter. That Kickstarter has reached funding of $2.2 million, with more funding, $7.5 million, to be also recently injected after a recent round of investment funding. This means that the project has been beefed up to nearly a $10 million budget and is targeting a 2019 launch. Camelot Unchained is currently in its closed beta and is a game that I am currently testing. Due to the NDA, I can't really share much about it. But what I can say is based on what has been released for the game so far. Camelot Unchained has the ability to be far greater than Dark Age of Camelot ever was. CU, as it's often dubbed, features a game designed to make crafting a paramount feature of the game, to support their total focus on realm versus realm PvP. You have the ability to essentially craft anything, including giant structures and castles. Think of a Minecraft building system of sorts. This off the bat ups the ante, as it was never something you could dream of doing in Dark Age of Camelot. Not to mention, all of this territory capturing grants you resources. So now resources and crafting are a very integral part of the realm versus realm experience. I wish Camelot Unchained and Mark Jacobs the best, and I look forward to that project continuing to be developed and hopefully be as successful as it can be. For those looking to play Dark Age of Camelot in the meantime, there are loads of friendly and helpful people you can speak to on the forums who will explain any problems you guys have with the game. The leveling experience is greatly altered at this point, and come their free-to-play launch, it might be worth rechecking out the game for those who missed out on it the first time. Though it's safe to say, if Camelot Unchained can be successful in the marketplace, it certainly could change the landscape of MMOs. And boy, is that exciting to think about. It's also beautiful to see the vision that made Dark Age of Camelot what it is. It still exists in Mark Jacobs, and its spiritual successor in Camelot Unchained. Dark Age of Camelot's death of a game might not be about its literal death, but I think it's safe to say Dark Age of Camelot won't be dying anytime soon. Not with its extra life. Thanks for watching, guys.
보야の竹林
飛燕万丈 頼むぜ
Mythic was founded by Mark Jacobs as an online game development company. Originally known as Adventures Unlimited Software in 1984, it focused early on creating online versions of games like Diplomacy, and then later Dragon's Gate, which was a rather popular MUD or multi-user dungeon that ran for over 17 years. Jacobs was seen as the sort of brain of the company, the method to the madness. By 1995, Mythic Entertainment was officially formed. They had a range of FPS and online RPG games. In 2011, Mythic Entertainment launched Dark Age of Camelot, the game that really defined the company. Dark Age of Camelot had a reported $3.2 million budget and was led by Ron Denton, co-founder of Mythic and lead programmer, and Matt Fiora. Dark Age of Camelot was a game about realm versus realm, which was very large-scale PvP or player warfare spread across wide areas known as realms. The game was unique in that it could be almost entirely played from the perspective of a PvP player, which also known as player versus player. Dark Age of Camelot had its shortcomings, but it was able to boast as high as a 250,000 person subscriber community. Dark Age of Camelot was also seen as a forefather of the PvP landscape for MMOs, and is very positively regarded by most. Mythic Entertainment then tried an early Warhammer Online, but the game was never fully produced or launched, and likely led to the company losing many of their resources. So the project came to an end in 2005 when Mark Jacobs announced they had secured the license to Warhammer Online from Games Workshop. Games Workshop was the company that owned the Warhammer IP. The game was announced shortly after. The Warhammer universe had existed for 20 plus years in the tabletop world, where it had board games and figurines, and also tons of novels to its credit. The full name of the game became Warhammer Online: Age of Reckoning, and Mythic Entertainment was then purchased by Electronic Arts, or EA for short, just a year after they announced the game in 2006. It's speculated this was because Mythic was running out of money to fund Warhammer Online and needed a big publisher to step in. EA renamed the company to EA Mythic, which was then renamed back to Mythic Entertainment just 2 years later, a few months before the launch of the game. Mark Jacobs, the founder of Mythic Entertainment, received flack for the merger because he had previously denied any allegations of a merger with Electronic Arts. Though he didn't outright lie, people felt like he was being rather much a lawyer in his statements and dodging, and the acquisition was only an acquisition in assets and a name change, according to Jacobs, and that the development of Warhammer would remain the same in the Mythic Studios located in Fairfax, Virginia. Though looking back, I'm not really sure how many people believe that. During the game's development cycle, Mythic employed a designer known as Paul Barnett to spearhead the creative directive of the game. Paul Barnett was a vivacious character who was very well known for his Warhammer feature videos, where he could make even non-fans become evangelists shortly after. Paul was an interesting character because he was known for saying statements like, "You shouldn't play MMOs because they corrupt your way of thinking when attempting to create other MMOs." Or his staunch stance against World of Warcraft, filled with quotes like, "I can't tell what is flaw and what is genius in WoW, so I don't want to get sucked into copying things in case I get the wrong one." The game was launched on September 18, 2008, which as previous viewers of my first Death of a Game video would probably realize that this is rather similar to Star Wars Galaxies, being a 3-year development cycle, which is rather short, again, in comparison to WoW, which had a 5-year development cycle. Also, like Star Wars Galaxies, Warhammer Online launched with good success and had sold 1.2 million copies, boasting a subscriber base of near 800,000. Despite an expansion launch in January 2009, called ARMS, the population had a gradual shrinkage to 300,000 just 1 year later. This could be in part due to the content of the expansion being mostly from the cut content that was already present in the beta version of the game, the new classes in particular. The expansion did add a new zone, but didn't add much in terms of fixing previous content or balancing the game. The number of servers in the game were then reduced to 13, a near 63 numbers of servers were shredded to consolidate for population issues, as the game was heavily reliant on a population to play. That same year, EA announced that they would be merging Mythic Entertainment with BioWare, who had recently just been acquired by EA. They would be merged under the title BioWare Mythic as an MMO-focused branch of EA, headed by Rei Mizuka. Rei was famously known as being a co-founder of BioWare. This restructuring of the companies coincided with the announcement of a new Star Wars MMO known as Star Wars The Old Republic. The joining of these companies likely was due to EA wanting Mythic to serve as a sort of advisor to BioWare, and BioWare having the chance to be involved in the currently running MMO Warhammer Online. Later in 2009, EA cut over 1/3 of the studio's workforce as part of their infamous job culling. By 2010, Warhammer was alluded to having less of a population than its spiritual father of a game, Dark Age of Camelot. This number was rumored to be around 50,000. In an attempt to garner more interest, the Warhammer team launched a mini-content expansion that made the Skaven, a popular race in the Warhammer universe, a playable race. However, it was playable by both Order and Destruction forces, not really serving as the third faction people would have assumed it would have been, or should have been. 2011 rolled by, and the game only had 3 servers left. To make matters worse, the game patched in Renown Rank 100 and Cash Shop features in an attempt to go free-to-play. BioWare Mythic was then renamed to Mythic Entertainment, likely due to EA or BioWare not wanting to have the stain of failure on their record. On December 18th, 2013, the game was brought down based on a mutual... we both know that wasn't mutual, and also doesn't that sound familiar? Agreement from Gamers Workshop, the owner of the Warhammer IP, and Mythic Entertainment, the owner of the Warhammer Online MMO. To wrap up the conclusion of the history portion of this video, the Warhammer story is a shorter one than my previous Star Wars Galaxies video, and leaves likely more questions as to why the game failed, since there wasn't some huge exodus brought on by a single patch or update like there was present in Star Wars Galaxies. Although Warhammer didn't have an ENGE of sorts, it had rather clear reasons and patterns as to why the game did eventually fail. Let's take a look at those, but first, let's talk about what the game did well. I noticed in my previous video, I didn't make it a point to point out what Star Wars Galaxies did right, and I wanted to make it a point in this video to do that with regards to Warhammer. What Warhammer did well was PvP. It had a simple RVR system, where you could level up with PvP and had skills progressions specifically for PvP known as Renown Ring. And then you had PvP focused servers, which allowed for PvP just about anywhere except for, you know, areas that were guarded by NPC guards. It captured the feeling of the Warhammer universe by making you feel like you were really warring against the races and factions. It took concepts that Dark Age of Camelot had made popular and it made them more accessible. This was both positive and negative. It had a strong lore that supported PvP in the game. PvP never really felt useless from a lore perspective. It always felt like you should be fighting each other. The dwarfs should be fighting the greenskins. The greenskins were taking their land. Or the humans had to fight against the chaos because they were the humans corrupted. The game also had bolstering in it, which allowed lower level players to be bolstered to a higher level so they could participate in higher level content. Something you see in most MMOs nowadays, like Guild Wars 2 and Lord of the Rings Online. Warhammer also had a feature of the game called the War Tomb of Knowledge. It had just about everything in the game in one easy to access place. Lore, achievements, titles, kill counts versus certain classes and factions, quest information, etc. It made the game easy to access and understand rather early on. It was a very efficient tutorial. The classes in Warhammer were all very distinct and unique. They had mirror classes, which generally served as the same class on the other side of the faction, Destruction versus Order, but these mirror classes weren't exact copies of each other. They had their own distinct lore and feel to them, something that unintentionally actually hurt the game in balancing ways. Healers were far more active than in most games, and you didn't really just sit back and heal the entire time. You had your own mechanics to manage. It was more active of a playstyle. In some cases, the healers had to actually do damage in order to supplement their healing. All classes had unique roles and unique feels and looks to them. The Bright Wizard and Sorcerer were ranged spellcasters who focused on dealing damage. However, their mechanic was unique because the more damage you did, the more you would either do to yourself or take in return. It was a careful balance. Or how the Chosen and the Knight of the Blazing Sun had auras in which they would rotate, and that these would then grant people buffs and such like that. The Warrior Priest and Disciple of Cain were melee-based healers. They had to rely on melee attacks to fuel their healing. Black Orcs and Swordmasters had stances they had to switch through, finishing in a finish ability. Ironbreakers and Blackguards had the typical hate and rage mechanic, where the more you attack, the more ability points and rage you gain, and then you can trigger more powerful abilities based off of that. The Archmage and Shaman had to balance their abilities to focus on either healing or damage. Rune Priest and Zealot had inscriptions and runes they would activate to grant heals and buffs. Slayer and Choppa, later expansion classes, had to balance their berserk mechanics. The more berserk they were, the more damage they did, but also took. Witch Hunter and Witch Elf used stealth and backstab mechanics to deal damage. White Lion and Marauder were medium armor DPS that each had unique abilities. Focus on usually things like debilitation and crowd control. Shadow Warrior and Squig Herder were ranged bow users who could either focus on range damage or melee damage. The Shadow Warrior having more of a ranged arrow focus, while the Squig Herder had a Squig pet. The Magus and Engineer classes were utility damage dealers that focused on dots and the use of pets. Warhammer also had morale abilities, which you got to use after you were in battle for some time. These abilities were unique to your class and had special effects. Think about them as MOBA's ultimate abilities. This is the first MMO I can really remember doing something like this. However, the biggest takeaway from Warhammer, funny enough, comes from the PvE features. You've likely seen it in every major MMO since. Public questing. This was a feature Warhammer revolutionized. It allowed people to participate in group questing and have a share of loot at the end without actually having to be in the same group. It gave people an incentive to play together, even if they weren't grouped together. Each race and faction had a different take on public quests, and some of them were located in PvP areas, so you also had to deal with a possible greenskin or dwarf running into your quest and causing havoc. So back to why the game failed. Well, why did the game fail? In the next section of this video, I will detail the largest contributing factors to the failure of the game. Otherworldly hype. Warhammer Online's marketing campaign is frankly one of the best MMO campaigns of all time. This starts with the website that they had. It looked and felt like a Warhammer Universe website. It had Realm Wars tracking, a character profile tracker, as well as lore and class explanations for the classes and races in the game. Certainly this, plus the Warhammer IP being introduced in an MMO format, are powerful factors in generating hype. But nothing is quite close to the impact a certain person had on the hype generated for Warhammer Online.
Warhammer, been around for a long time. It's really exciting, and it's really good if you're going to do an MMO, because it does lots of really important things. The first thing it does, it's iconic in its look. They've had 23 years to get this right. We know what elves look like, we know how powerful orcs are, we know how gritty dwarves can be. So we've got to look. That's dead important, and we've been following it in the game. The second thing we need is an excuse to smash the living crap out of each other. And we've got that. Pages, novels, thousands of pages of reasons why dwarves don't like the green skins, and the dark elves don't like the high elves, and humans don't like chaos. So that's great. But the third and most important thing, if you're going to have a subscription-based MMO, is a perpetual war. You can't have an end. That would be bad, and Warhammer helps us again. The whole thing is built so that there is no ending. There is just epic, heroic, perpetual struggle, or any combination, a struggle that's epically heroic. And that's what we're doing. We're taking that idea, we know how people can fight, we know what they look like, we know they're going to smash each other to pieces.
Paul Barnett hit the gaming world by storm and was sort of an enigma when he was introduced as the creative director for Warhammer Online. Barnett oozed charisma, but he was clearly a very passionate nerd himself. Both nerds and casual players could relate to that, because he spoke like he was an sultry savant, but with a sweet English undertone to it. Paul Barnett was a guy who would likely make soap sounds. Instead, he was given a well-established IP, Warhammer, that was relatively underutilized in the non-tabletop world and completely underutilized in the MMO space. Paul had books full of lore for the races and classes of Warhammer, and he was able to really explain this with the strength of his ability to orate. As a personal angle, Paul was the reason I found and was interested in it. Because watching his videos on what Warhammer was, and what Realm vs. Realm was, really mesmerized. I found myself watching all of these class and race breakdowns, eager to drink any bit of information in the game that I could. I also played the game far after being let down by overhype, perhaps because I am a bit of a masochist, but mostly because I loved the world that the game took place in, and I thought that the PvP was fun. Having a widely successful marketing campaign sounds like a positive, right? Well, not when the product was really fit what was being advertised. Have you ever bought a game that was nothing like you expected it to be, and were thoroughly let down? Even if the game was good, it didn't fit what was described initially. You were let down, because when you advertise something as an otherworldly type of prestige, the only place your expectations can go when the game doesn't meet that hype is down. You have to keep marketing on a leash when you're advertising for a game. Adding flavor and charisma is the spice of life and advertising. Just make sure you don't find yourself being a sleazy oil salesman, selling things that aren't really in the game. People don't like to be misled. Performance issues and balance issues. Warhammer was a game that focused on realm versus realm PvP, destruction versus order. However, it's hard to have warfare on such a large scale where performance issues are so rampant upon launch, even years after. The game's engine was never very impressive, not from a performance or feel perspective, though it did manage to have things like siege weapons, unit collision to some extent. But people said that WoW was seen as the bastion of performance, and we played WoW and then Warhammer undoubtedly felt clunkier in comparison. It also didn't, frankly, run as effectively. Clunky hurt new players trying the game out, for sure, but for the people who got used to it, wanting to participate in PvP content, they were then met with performance woes. So it's like you managed to slug through that mud part, because that's what it sort of felt like, the engine to some extent. It felt like you were walking through the mud. And then you think that you finally got to the water, time to rinse off, and then you get to the water and it's all muddy too. Trying to participate in large sieges was near impossible unless you had some monster PC, and even then you could barely scratch 20 FPS. I mean, it was a slideshow in some of these big battles, even if you had, at the time, I couldn't even tell you what the Premier graphics card was, but even if you had that, you still struggled. I personally used to play on an ancient computer that at best could have like 30 FPS if I was looking at the ground or something. And when I tried to PvP, I would just have like 15 FPS and would often freeze. When you have low and mid-tier computers that can barely even play the game, you alienate a large percentage of players. It's one thing that WoW did so effectively. The balance issues were also terrible. Warhammer had balance issues for years after its launch. At launch, you had Magus players pressing the Rift ability button, balling a bunch of people together, and people would just nuke that. Mythic didn't really learn from the DAOC days. They seemed to let crowd control very rampant. I thought crowd control was a cool feature in Warhammer, but when you don't put a very good cap of it or a very good CC reduction after you've been CC'd already, you just have massive CC fests. The Magus Rift ability, for example, it could pull people close into it, and then when you could combine it with other AoE abilities, it would just have this ball of death sucking people in. And then they also had this thing called a nuke group, which happened later in the game, where you would have a bunch of like bright wizards together and they would run around spamming the same AoE nuke and just destroying people. Games are hard enough to balance in 1v1 situations, but when you take 10 of the same class and have them in the same fight, you have fights that can be easily exploited by specific types of groups and gimmicks. Part of this imbalance was because of the attempt at mirror classes. Instead of having direct mirror classes, Mythic tried to make each class really unique. Even if, say, the Chosen and the Knight of the Blazing Sun had the same archetype and foundation for a class, the Chosen in nearly all iterations of the game was more focused on damage, while the Knight of the Blazing Sun was more focused on CC. In some cases, you had a mirror class objectively better than the other. In most iterations, the Witch Hunter outperformed the Witch Elf because of its finisher abilities being ranged abilities, while the Witch Elf had no idea finishers. This meant that more people wanted to play the Order than Destruction, or vice versa. This changed obviously as the game progressed. Balancing would change. People would do what's called X-realming, which one side is doing well, they make another tune and start playing on that. And that's kind of unheard of in certain games, but not in Warhammer because Tier 1 was the most balanced part of the game, and frankly one of the most fun parts. People typically didn't mind having to read new characters. At one point I can remember that Order ruled over almost every single server. The server I played on that time was ruled by a clan named Ruin. I'm sure if people played the game, you remember Ruin. They used to have multiple clans. They had like 1,000 members or something ridiculous at one point. And they would just run around in massive 100-person warbands, capping every single heap, and you would just get stomped. During the same point, you had the Witch Hunter that was better than the Witch Elf, the Bright Wizard was better than the Sorcerer, etc. With only 2 factions, this means that the game can very easily get unfun when one side is dominating the other. Lack of content and cut content. Theme park MMOs are MMOs which are heavily reliant on content. This is why games like Rings Online and World of Warcraft have had so many content expansions. Warhammer only had one real expansion and fairly few content patches. This is a game that ran for 5 years. The expansion they did have, Call of Arms, added 2 classes that were cut from the beta portion of the game. Expansions that add cut content are rarely met with a positive reception. Consumers believe they are warranted or deserve that content already, so they're not really necessarily happy to see it. They're more of like, yeah, we know, we deserve that. The zone Call to Arms added was positively received, but Call to Arms was like most MMO expansions where they focus on adding new content without fixing prior content, so even if the new zone was cool, people were still complaining about the same old. Lack of content was a weakness that affected Warhammer up until its ultimate demise. You can't have a game that's reliant on developer content, like a theme park game, and then not have an increase in developer content. Players don't have a strong way of affecting content in a theme park game, like they would in the sandbox game, for example. So they're very reliant on the developers of the game to provide them with more content, or at least fix the existing. A third faction. How do you deal with one faction being more popular than the other? one faction stomping the other faction constantly, a 70-to-30 ratio, something ridiculous. Well, you introduced a third faction. Mythic had experience with this. You would think they wouldn't make such a mistake, especially when in the beta version of the game, people complained about this. They said that this could cause people concern. Dark Age of Camelot, which is a Mythic game, had three factions. This was something PlanetSide also did well. You have three factions to prevent one faction from being too powerful. When the basis of the game is on war, realm versus realm PvP, if one faction is more popular or powerful than the other, especially on a PvP server, it makes for a very boring game. Especially when the winning side gets even more benefits and bonuses. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And then the losing side decides to change factions because frankly they're tired of losing. And then the winning side gets even more powerful. The game initially talked about 6 factions. Elves, dwarves, humans, chaos, dark elves. Now, these were never said to have been separate factions per se, but we know the Warhammer universe can support multiple factions. You would think that Mythic would understand that maybe having 2 factions wasn't the best idea, especially when in their previous most popular Realm vs. Realm game, they didn't have 2 factions, they had 3. If you have a third faction, problems as previously described don't happen, because as DAOC and PlanetSide demonstrated, if one faction gets too powerful, the other factions can always band together and take them out. Or maybe just have some equal combat between each other. DAOC and PlanetSide demonstrated, if one faction gets too powerful, the other factions can always band together and take them out. Or maybe just have some equal combat between each other. Warhammer's lore supported 3 factions. There could have been a Skaven faction. Skavens were a rat-like race that fought all of the factions in Warhammer. They were in the game, but not playable in any capacity until a later patch in the game, and even then it wasn't actually a third faction that was introduced. It was more of like a new class for both factions to play. A Skaven faction would add more content, another PvP opponent, and really help with the balancing in factions in the game. But likely weren't an option since Mythic seemed to have delusions that focusing on PvE content would be helpful to the game. Or maybe they just never had the resources. Likely a combination of both. If you are going to focus on PvP, go all in. War is coming. This was the slogan you heard or read when watching a Warhammer video or reading the Warhammer website. It was about war, siege weapons, realm versus realm, conquest, territorial warfare. Why was PvE such a large part of the game? I have no issues with PvE. However, making it a very important part of the game that focused on PvP was just strange. Why was raid gear more effective than some PvP gear? Why were raids even PvE focused? Why didn't we have raids that had PvP elements in them? The best quests in the game were quests that focused on PvP. Realm quests, kill quests, PvEVP quests were the best part of PvE. You would start in the game in a PvE zone, have to go through these PvE areas without having any access to PvP yet until you reach a certain level. Now you could theoretically run straight to the RBR lake in PvP or queue up for a scenario, but if the game was about war, why couldn't you spawn and then bam, war is around you? Yes, there's things like gankers and griefers, but they could have integrated PvE with PvP more, especially later on in the game where you have to repeatedly do quests in order to level, really. Even though the game allows you to level up doing PvP, it's not really as effective as PvEing. The initial impression of Warhammer Online was that you could just level up doing PvP. It's one thing to level up doing PvP, and another to level up doing PvE and then PvP. One is like objectively better than the other. Sure, you can travel to Canada from Mexico by walking, but who actually wants to do that? No, most people are going to take the plane, right? Well, it's the same in Warhammer Online. How many people are actually going to PvP every single second in order to level while they're playing against other people in their tier who have PvE gear and PvE advantages? PvP should have been the main way of leveling in the game, and PvE should have been supplemental, or at least just make them completely equal. Tier 1 in Warhammer was the most balanced and best experience in all of the game. There were little to no balance issues, lobies fighting lobies, and no abilities to be exploited and gimmicked in large groups. This was the part of the game you wanted your fan base to play the most. So why was PvE such a large part of it? I recently played the early game experience on a private server, and I was just taken aback remembering how much PvE is in the game, especially early on. I'm very surprised by that. It's like, why is there so much PvE in this game? Either the game is about war, or it's about war and then quests and then war. You can have a middle ground, like combining PvP elements and PvE elements, like DAOC did in some instances, but having these completely separate features felt really disconnected in the game. PvP and war. War is in the name. Warhammer. EA and its vice. Oh, EA. They were voted the worst company in America 2 years in a row. They've had their hands in tons of franchises, have more company takeovers and buyouts than I have words in this write-up. They're often seen as a villain in the video game world, and this is probably likely due to their strong focus on business over art. They have been caught hammering review scores, supporting shady DRMs, and have rushed and killed a few notable games. Sure, some of that could be warranted, but some of it probably is a bit unwarranted, though EA ultimately has had their share of missteps. EA is a successful company because they know how to deliver. Sadly, this can be taking away what makes certain companies unique. Companies they end up buying out and taking over. BioWare and Mythic, for example, were bought by EA, and many would argue that their creativity suffered because of it. Publishers have nearly always been seen as a necessary evil, where small companies go to the big daddy publisher to help publish and distribute their game. Lately, we have where smaller companies are trying to go directly to the fans to get funding for the products. However, we haven't seen any of these be successful, so it still seems like publishers are still very much relevant. When EA bought Mythic, they certainly changed the focus of Warhammer Online and the company in general. This is rather evident in Jacobs, a founder of the company, exiting shortly after the purchase of the company. Mark had initially said that business would continue as usual, which fans found and programmed to ignore. It's mostly speculation to assume what changed. However, we can focus on Warhammer and its trajectory as a product. Warhammer was never a true failure. It was a commercial success. Although it didn't meet its initial expectations, it was still able to boast a 300k subscriber base almost as late as 2010. But EA didn't seem to treat it like it was successful, even though it had sold 1.2 million copies. That 300,000 subscriber base shrunk from 2009 to 2011 to a reported less than 50,000 players. But this made sense. The game was not getting any content patches or expansions. The game ran for 5 years and had one expansion during that time and probably less than 3 to 4 content patches. This is a stark contrast from Star Wars Galaxies from my previous video, which some would argue that the game was changed too much. Warhammer Online wasn't changed enough. The client was still clunky, their performance still suffered, and there was next to no new content introduced. MMOs are games which must have content added to them, otherwise eventually people get bored of playing the same thing over and over again, especially when the same thing is an unbalanced PvP experience. Even sandbox-type games need new content introduced, or at least new features, and those games are more driven by players. The decision to make Warhammer a mostly theme park experience was a huge decision. But in order to support such a game, you need to do it well and Lord True. Add constant expansions and content. Warhammer Online needed an NGE. It needed a Final Fantasy XIV 2.0. It needed a Rift Upheaval patch, a WoW category. Instead, given the neglect, EA had Mythic merged with BioWare, likely in an attempt to get them to help or provide experience for their upcoming MMO, SWTOR. During SWTOR development, it's not coincidental that Warhammer suffered during this period of 2009 to 2012. Warhammer had potential, and people stood by the game despite it not having large changes for years. But people can only take so much neglect. EA might have the money to support your game, and the funding, but they have shown a severe lack in creativity or vision. It really seems like a place your company goes to die. Hopefully this isn't the case with BioWare, but with disappointing games like Dragon Age Inquisition, I fear that the company is more of the same from EA, launching of unfinished games and lacking substance. Unfortunately, Mythic did see its death under EA, Hopefully BioWare doesn't share the same fate. EA is definitely the Scrooge of the video game world, and everyone hates Scrooge. EA Louse. In 2011, there was a figure only known as EA Louse. This person was an artist let go in a round of layoffs from BioWare Mythic. EA Louse wrote a scathing piece on his or her time with the company. EA Louse was rather ruthless in some of his or her opinions on SWTOR and the developers working on Warhammer Online. Although we can't really say EA Louse was a reason the game failed, I still figured it was relevant enough to bring up as a separate point. EA Louse was significant because it was the first time we heard the story of Warhammer Online from an inside source. This wasn't just protocol talk. This was anger. This was off the cuff. Louse accused Jeff Hickman, the lead producer of the game, of being nothing more than a yes man. Louse also accused Rob Denton, a co-founder of the company, as being controlling and not really open to outside opinions, something not very good for a leader of a company. Louse said that Jacobs, the main force behind the company, had a rather hands-off approach in regards to meeting with the team. He was very much out on his own handling his own design philosophies. We don't really know what he was doing, that's just how it was described. This was especially true after the company was acquisitioned by EA. Jacobs was said to have mutually parted with the company, but many people, including EA Louse, believed he was fired to have a more pro-EA leader. According to Louse, to divide his salary up, and because Rob Denton, the co-founder, stabbed him in the back or whatever, that probably was a little bit of projecting. Jacobs seemed to take the majority of the rap for the game, despite Louse disputing it should have been his co-founder Rob Denton, who had far more control over the project. Jeff Hickman was a CSR rep who handled customer relations and was then promoted to handle the production of Warhammer Online with no previous experience in doing such. We don't know if EA Louse was completely right about all of these things, could have been spoiled grapes, but one thing EA Louse was right on, which is not really related to this video, was that SWTOR was most certainly a failure. It was a commercial failure in the sense that, well, I think BioWare said it was going to have 3 million subscribers in the first winter or something ridiculous like that, but that's a tangent. We don't know if EA Louse is right or wrong about any of this. He or she clearly had some inside information. I don't think all of it is false. I think we should take it with a grain of salt. And from the sounds of it, maybe Mark Jacobs was treated as a scapegoat. We'll never really know, but it's rather interesting to think about. Conclusion. Warhammer Online was fun times for me. The PvP was memorable, and I really thought that the classes were great at feeling distinct and unique. The game went from its 800k subscribers to 300k and then 50k until it saw its eventual shutdown in 2013. But the game still has a loyal fanbase, as can be shown in its currently running EMU, or private server, known as Warhammer Return Awakening. I will link it in the description and put an annotation on screen. The server is able to boast as much as 1,400 players on its server, averaging around 400 to 500 players, depending on when you play. EU times would be higher, 700 or so. But Warhammer in its original iteration is shut down, same as Mythic, the company that created it. Hopefully after watching this video you have a better understanding of why and how the game failed. Remember, the takeaway from these videos is the insight on the game and its failure. Hopefully, the knowledge to not let something like that happen again. I do not want people to pile on EA, though if you want to, that's absolutely your prerogative. You probably have to get in line though. Thanks for watching the video. For more Death of a Game videos, subscribe to my channel. I also have a newer series called What Blank Game Did Well, coming soon, where I will have shorter format videos focused on highlighting which games of all possible genres do or did well. If you like this video, please drop a like or a comment why you didn't or did like the video. Nerdslayer out for duh.
いいかしがみついて耐えるんだ
Online, a full loop, territory control-based MMO. It was a game that took what a game like UO or Ultima Online did and took it to the next level. It combined the brutality of a full loop MMO like Ultima Online as well as their skill system, which was a skill system much like a skill system in Skyrim. Out of 100, where each time you swing your weapon or you bang a pickaxe, you're going to get some skill gains versus having a combat level or an overall level like in, say, World of Warcraft. Darkfall Online also had elements from Asheron's Call, like stat management and some of its quest features. It's a bit weird, though, to say that Asheron's Call and Ultima are influences on Darkfall Online, because, well, Darkfall Online is actually rather old. Its history starts as old as 2000, where it spawned as an idea from a Norwegian company called Razor Wax.
これでよし
Razor Wax was founded by Klaus Grovdal, Jetel Helen, and Ricky Sickington. Razor Wax soon after announcing their new idea for a title partnered up with a few other developers, Zad Meldawi, Tassos Monoporos, and Spiros Ordonez. Tassos, of course, is known as the lead producer behind Darkfall, and a source of many people's scorn. The now named Aventurine team moved their company to Greece, where it would be easier to secure funds for creating their idea for an MMO, as well as have cheaper costs of operations compared to Norway. So Aventurine, now located in Greece, is going to begin development on Darkfall, which, as Klaus Grovdal, the lead developer, explained it as a next-generation online role-playing game that is highly geared towards player-run clans, controlling kingdoms and capturing kingdoms from other player-run clans. Unlike other existing online games on the market, Darkfall was designed from the ground up to cater more towards the PvP-interested players. But we also have everything you would expect to find in an online role-playing game. Tons of quests, trade skills, magical items, and hundreds of different scary monsters lurking in dungeons. Most importantly to note, though, for the focus of the game was the theme of control, whether it meant controlling resources, mob spawns, PvP territories, or even entire islands. Another quote from Klaus says that the basic concept of Darkfall was the struggle for power, the control between the different races. This, along with the player-run clans fighting for kingdoms, dungeons, and resources, was supposed to drive the game. It's important I mention these tidbits from devs of the game, these little quotes about the vision, at least the vision early on, because something you will begin to notice as the story of Darkfall unfolds is that there are some rather vocal vets of the game who claim to know what the game is meant to be, or should be. The next quote was really an eye-opener in retrospect. Darkfall is freedom, to have fun straight from the box. There are no set grinds that you need to go through in order to enjoy the end game. There's no level grind, no money grind, no item grind. You should just go out and start having fun doing whatever it is you want to enjoy, and you can focus on PvP, trade, or adventure. Oh. And I'm sure Darkfall players in unison around the world are chuckling at that. But it was the original vision for Darkfall. Nothing much was heard about Darkfall until 2005, where a sign-up page was made for a closed beta. The closed beta never came, but what did come was a new training gameplay. I was unable to locate this footage, but it was released as something to bide over the people who clearly were interested in the game and signed up to get the updates, and then realized that the beta wasn't out. Tassos Morris explained that a decision had been made internally to devote additional money and resources to expanding the scope of the game, and this was cited as the reason for the delay. At E3 in the year 2006, Aventurine allowed Select Media to view a private build of the game, one that Tintin Hammer was able to get their hands on. It's a bit odd that for a game that was supposed to go into a closed beta was only able to be played by Select Media sites, but for those thirsty for information, like I was, they weren't really complaining. A quote from the hands-on article that Tintin published after the call was, after a brief, John broke the interview on by asking what they disliked some of these elements, how they handled those elements. They answered immediately, saying that they were grinding, combat systems, and PvP. Darkfall, of course, aims to solve all of these things, to make grinding less of a thing by having a free-form skill system, where you can choose the skills that you want to have, and then you actually actually have to go out in the world to increase that space. So you're playing the game. Playing the game is quote unquote fun. Their idea of having a fun combat system was what many would consider a mix between an arena game like Quake and an RPG MMORPG with spells and spells. Finally, the PvP aspect was something that really made Darkfall unique in the market, at least at the time. A time where PvP games reigned supreme. Darkfall boasted a full-loop PvP system with territory control. An announcement on the 11th of July 2006 stated that the new preparations were being made to push the game to a beta state. Aventurine was still unable to secure a publisher at the time, but they stated that they would self-publish if needed. Through the use of a news site RPG Vault, Tassos released new screenshots of the game. Some of the earliest screenshots of the game, in fact. Tassos boasted things like mobs being able to sense you and smell and sight and even your shadows, and this was probably done in part to help secure a publisher. But a publisher still didn't come. 6 months later, there was still no beta in sight. But on January 17th, 2007, Tassos made a post on the Darkfall forums stating that they were in talks with publishers and a beta client was playable on remote servers. The beta development milestone was met early in December. Since then, we've had a fully functional and stable beta build on remote servers, which is being patched regularly. At the moment, we're using part of the system to show the game to prospective partners, distributors, publishers, technology providers, and etc. Our motivations here is to provide the best quality assurance, distribution, and service for the game and its players, so we consider this to be a very important phase for Darkfall. And since people at this point were considering the game vaporware, or saying that the game didn't really exist, Tassos had this to say. It's easy to imagine that 5 minutes is all it takes to make an update. A developer will pop online to say hi, or that we could just appoint someone from the community to generate updates. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works in a professional environment. There are clear guidelines, we're bound by NDAs, all disclosure needs to be approved, as is the case with most development studios. Often due to disclosure issues, we're forced to be vague or talk around topics, and this is sometimes mistaken for coyness by those who wish to interpret that way. Sorry. We get plenty of requests for publicity. Most of them involve us having to create regular content, or answering question interviews we've answered a million times before. Answers to questions we haven't answered before are often in the realm of information we're not allowed to discuss. All of our resources are put into game development. It's a stretch for us to keep organized in order to create Darkfall features and updates. Even so, taking a look at what other MMOs in development are doing, it seems that we've produced more substantial content than most, while giving the community an extensive and truthful look under the hood. Where do we even start with this comment? This whole thing just reeks of bull. Specifically where they state that if they don't respond to criticism or the community, it's because we are busy. This is an excuse that Aventurine used very early on and continue to use throughout the entirety of it. But you have to remember, Darkfall was a great hope for me, including myself. We kept hoping that this small company, even with arrogant responses like that from their lead producer Tassos, believing that this small company basically would make the MMO that we all had been waiting for. As April 2008 came along, Aventurine came out and stated that Darkfall was feature complete. Darkfall is feature complete, and we're doing beta testing using professional testers, as we said before. This, of course, bred suspicion, or at least even more suspicion, because people were already assuming that the game was going to launch, that the game was vaporware. But all of a sudden, they had professional testers. 1 month later, though, an Aventurine released a statement on the matter. In this week's update, we answered questions from the community. There are several we haven't answered on purpose, going to demonstrate these instead. Many of you are asking for a video. We hear you. We're on it as soon as we can. There's always many questions in the public beta and release dates. To this that I can say now, during a planning meeting, we determined that our launch would be inside 2008, with the public beta preceding it by a few weeks. This is official, and internally, we're a lot more specific. Pending an announcement, we cannot say more at this time. And not much was said more for a few months. Well, August 2008, 3 years after the first beta, Darkfall's official beta was announced, was a company finally, by a footage. This footage showcased things like PvP systems, siege warfare, ships and naval combat, as well as mountain combat and tons more. These videos got hundreds of thousands of views. The hype was boiling at that point. Early impressions of beta said things like, "This game is extremely solid, it just needs polish. We've done all the fundamentals right. The remaining problems are things like UI, tweaking AI, and hardware compatibility issues." Another person said, "I've been testing for 3 to 4 days now and just seen a minimum of all the world has to offer, but I can give my compliments on the design. I tried most of these starter areas, and I felt like they were really well done. I find the surrounding area all varied and give a good sense of feeling of a real world." Although some of these were, well, early impressions, they were largely positive ones. Now, these were the only ones that were released by Tassos and Aventurine and crew, so maybe there were also naysayers, but it's fair to say that people saw great potential with the game. And for the landscape of 2008, the game, despite being an idea almost 8 years old, was still holding up to the test of time. Sure, some could look at the game for 2008 and say that the graphics seemed lacking, and the UI was certainly dated, but people were still having overwhelmingly positive impressions of the game. I am one of those people that certainly judge the game based on appearance alone, but when I got the chance to play the game, my opinion of it changed greatly, which is something that really can happen to you too. You might look at this video and see the gameplay on screen, but you can't really appreciate Darkfall for what it is unless you understand its core concepts. You play the game for yourself. But Aventurine deciding to launch Darkfall with 2 servers was a decision that many would argue would hurt the game tremendously. A launch date of January 22nd of 2009 was announced for Darkfall Online. As the community was used to with Aventurine, the game didn't launch in that day. It was pushed to February 18th, 2009. This was 4 years after the first beta was supposed to be playable. Because players had already played the beta of the game, they knew that despite Aventurine's goals of Darkfall not being grind-based, the game was heavily grind-based. So NA players, regardless of region, were going to play at EU launch, especially since Aventurine confirmed that they would allow these EU and NA expats to transfer to NA servers when the NA server launched later that year. The game was pushed a few more days to the 25th, and pre-orders for Darkfall Online opened on the 19th. As the Darkfall Info website explained, the massive volume of hits to the site pretty much broke the systems in place, and Aventurine had to take the pre-order sales down. In the days between the pre-order date and launch, there were apparently small windows of time where people managed to get in and secure a pre-order for the launch. Reading various forums, including the official Darkfall forums, it appears a rather large percentage of customers who wanted to get on launch date are out of luck, as the account system issues are still prevalent and performance issues are still being addressed. Reactions on the web vary from seething finger pointing at the developer to championing of Aventurine for wanting to resolve all major issues to letting any more players in the game. Unfortunately, some customers who claim that they have had successful pre-order experiences claim that they still cannot get authorization to play the game. So although the game was supposed to be playable in just a few days, it was anything but buyable. Many of the players were unable to secure a copy of the game, including me. This is not to mention the issues Darkfall had at its actual launch. If you were actually able to secure a copy, you got into a server that took 12 hours into the supposed launch window for the game to, well, work because of a server issue that made mobs invisible. During this time, there were people that were already taking advantage of this, bugging out mobs and scoring nice loot. Players cried for a rollback, but no rollback happened. So the launch, of course, was anything but smooth, but to the dedicated fans of the game, especially those who hadn't had a chance to play in the beta, they were thrilled that they could finally play the game they saw as a savior to PvP MMOs. Likely due to its niche status, unsmooth launch, and non-existent PR, released or mute devs, the game didn't really get a lot of press coverage. The biggest media site to cover the game was Eurogamer. where they rated the game as a 2 out of 10 with a scathing review. Tassos, in typical Tassos fashion, flexed his muscles and released information that showed that the Eurogamer had only played the game for 2 hours. Needless to say, the rabid fans were up in arms, and justifyingly so. In-game, they all took turns declaring war on Eurogamer's clan, showing that they stood in unison as a community, something quite commendable for a community that was always at each other's throats. All of that drama aside, the EU launch was in full effect. NPC towns and early areas were bloodbaths. Massive guilds were fighting against one another in controlled territories, and all the while players were finding more and more secrets to exploit and get ahead of the competition. According to Klaus Grovedal's LinkedIn, Darkfall sold over 300,000 copies throughout its life, though early launch was probably only a fourth of that number. Still, 10 to 20 man groups were considered small for the time. And this is crazy, especially if you consider that Darkfall was a mega server, and all of those players were on the same server. So you had these small 10 to 20 man groups running around, but you had groups as big as 100 people sieging. The NA launch was targeted later that year for July 13th, 2009. It was accompanied by a free expansion that added monster rebalancing, player housing, Darkfall's village system, the Nexus system, a character specialization system, the weather system, and special items. People who wanted to transfer to the NA server had to wait 3 months to give players time to catch up in regards to character advantage. Except this was one of the largest mistakes Aventurine made. This change of course split the population of the game. Not to mention that the NA players who would play on the EU servers to get their characters ahead are likely to be more hardcore. So when those players came over to the NA server, they dominated the server, and many of the NA players couldn't compete or quit out of frustration to how poor the whole thing was handled. Especially because by the time the characters from EU transferred over, Magic had taken over Darkfall, and a lot of those very hardcore players were very aware of that very early on. The second expansion hit Darkfall on December 2009. This expansion was titled Conquer the Seas. Conquer the Seas expansion was the largest changes that had happened to the game yet, with changes such as siege fixing, sea villages, trade routes, race differentiation, and even more ways to customize your character. It added a plethora of new mobs as well as quests, something that the game desperately needed for the time. But as 2010 closed in on Darkfall, so did the infamous no update period. Now this period actually did have changes technically, but many people classify